Who were the Pharisees? When you hear that word, what comes to mind? For many of us, the first image is probably a villain from the Bible stories. Stern-faced, self-righteous men in long robes, always trying to trap Jesus with tricky questions. And it's true, the Gospels often show them in conflict with Jesus. He called them out for their hypocrisy, and they were part of the group that pushed for his crucifixion. So, case closed, right? They're just the bad guys. Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. And honestly, it's way more interesting. If we only see them as one-dimensional villains, we miss a huge part of the story and a really important piece of history. So today, let's peel back the layers and take a closer look at who the Pharisees really were, what they believed, and why they mattered so much in the world of Jesus. It's a story that might just change the way you read the Bible. To really get the Pharisees, we need to hop in our time machine and go back a few hundred years before Jesus was even born. The story starts around the 2nd century BC, a time of massive upheaval for the Jewish people. They were living under the rule of Greek kings, specifically the Seleucid Empire, and a king named Antiochus Epiphanes. This guy was bad news. He wanted everyone in his empire to become Greek, or Hellenistic. That meant adopting Greek culture, Greek religion, and Greek customs. For the Jewish people, this was a disaster. He desecrated the temple in Jerusalem, set up an altar to Zeus, and banned core Jewish practices like circumcision and observing the Sabbath. It was a full-on assault on their faith and identity. In response, a rebellion broke out, led by a family known as the Maccabees. This was the Maccabean Revolt. It was a fight for religious freedom, a fight to preserve their way of life and their covenant with God. And against all odds, they won. They kicked out the Greeks and rededicated the temple. This is the event celebrated by the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. Out of the ashes of this conflict, several different groups, or sects, emerged within Judaism. Everyone was asking the same question. How do we stay faithful to God in this new, changing world? But they had very different answers. You had the Sadducees, who were mostly the wealthy, priestly aristocracy. They were more politically connected, more open to Hellenistic culture, and they were very conservative in their religious views. They only accepted the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, as authoritative scripture. Then you had the Essenes, who were like spiritual separatists. They believed the temple and the mainstream priesthood had become corrupt. So, they withdrew from society, living in monastic communities like the one at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. They were waiting for God to intervene and purify everything. And then you had the Pharisees. Their name likely comes from a Hebrew word, perushim, which means the separated ones. But they weren't separated like the Essenes, who left society. They were separated in a different way. They were dedicated to living a life of holiness and purity, separated from the influences that they felt were a corrupting Jewish life. They were mostly lay people, not priests. They were scribes, scholars, and small business owners, the educated middle class of their day. So what did the Pharisees believe? This is where it gets really interesting. Unlike the Sadducees, the Pharisees believed in the entire Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament. But they didn't stop there. They believed that alongside the written Torah given to Moses on Mount Sinai, God also gave an oral Torah, an oral tradition of interpretation and application that had been passed down through generations of teachers. This was a huge deal. They believed the Bible wasn't just a static, ancient text. It needed to be applied to daily life, to new situations and new challenges that weren't explicitly covered in the written law. Think about it. The Torah says, keep the Sabbath day holy. But what does that actually mean in practice? What constitutes work? Can you carry something? Can you tie a knot? The Pharisees developed detailed guidelines to help ordinary people live out these commands faithfully in every part of their lives. This oral Torah was their way of building what they called a fence around the law, a set of protective measures to ensure no one would even accidentally break one of God's commands. Their goal was to bring holiness out of the temple and into every home, every marketplace, and every moment of an ordinary person's life. They also believed in some things that might surprise you, things that are foundational to Christianity today. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees did not. The Pharisees believed in an afterlife with rewards and punishments. The Sadducees did not. The Pharisees believed in angels and spirits. The Sadducees did not. So, in many ways, Jesus' theological world was much, much closer to the Pharisees than to any other group. When the Apostle Paul, in the book of Acts, wants to state his credentials, he says, "I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee." He was proud of his heritage. So if they believed in so many of the same things, why all the conflict with Jesus? This is the million-dollar question. And the answer isn't that they were just evil or that their beliefs were all wrong. The conflict was often about the how, not the what. It was about priorities and the heart behind the rules. Jesus' main critique of some of the Pharisees wasn't their desire to obey God. It was that they had allowed their traditions, that fence around the law, to become more important than the law itself. They focused so much on the external details of piety that they neglected the heart of the matter: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Remember when Jesus said, "You tithe mint and dill and cumin, but have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness." He wasn't saying tithing was bad. It was saying you're so focused on this tiny detail that you're missing the whole point. Think of the stories about healing on the Sabbath. For the Pharisees, the tradition said that healing was a form of work, and it was forbidden on the Sabbath unless it was a life-threatening emergency. So when Jesus healed a man with a withered hand or a woman who had been crippled for 18 years, they were furious. He had broken their rules, but Jesus turned it back on them. He asked, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" He was showing that their rule, which was designed to honor God, was actually preventing them from doing God's work of showing compassion and bringing restoration. The fence had become a prison. Another major point of conflict was hypocrisy. Jesus called them whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but are full of death on the inside. He accused them of doing their religious acts praying, fasting, giving to the poor to be seen and praised by others, not out of a genuine love for God and neighbor. Their piety had become a performance. They loved the best seats in the synagogue and the respectful greetings in the marketplaces. They were more concerned with their reputation for holiness than with actual holiness. It's crucial to understand, though, that Jesus probably wasn't condemning all Pharisees. He was speaking to specific individuals and a specific mindset he saw within the group. The Gospels show us that not all Pharisees were hostile to him. A Pharisee named Nicodemus came to Jesus by night, genuinely seeking to understand who he was. After Jesus' death, Nicodemus helped Joseph of Arimathea give Jesus a proper burial, a risky and compassionate act. In the book of Acts, a very respected Pharisee named Gamaliel advises the Sanhedrin to leave the apostles alone, saying if their movement is from God, they won't be able to stop it anyway. So there was diversity of thought and character within the group. The Pharisees were popular with the common people. People respected their knowledge of the scriptures and their devotion. They saw them as the spiritual guides of the nation. This is why their opposition to Jesus was so significant. They were influential leaders, and their rejection of him swayed public opinion. When they accused him of blasphemy or of breaking the Sabbath, people listened. After the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD, Judaism faced another massive crisis. The Sadducees, whose power was tied to the temple and its sacrificial system, basically disappeared. The Essenes were wiped out. It was the Pharisees, with their focus on the Torah, prayer, and righteous living in the everyday, who were able to carry Judaism forward. The traditions of the Pharisees became the foundation for what is known as Rabbinic Judaism, which is the basis for most forms of Judaism practiced today. Their system of interpreting and applying scripture to daily life allowed the faith to survive and thrive without a temple. In a way, the legacy of the Pharisees is the survival of the Jewish faith itself. So, how should we think about the Pharisees today? It's not about simply labeling them as the bad guys. It's about learning from their story. Their zeal for God's law was commendable. Their desire to live holy lives was good. Where they went wrong, according to Jesus, was in letting their traditions overshadow compassion, letting their external piety become a substitute for internal transformation, and letting their pride get in the way of recognizing God at work right in front of them. And that's a warning for all of us, isn't it? It's so easy for any religious person, in any era, to fall into the same trap, to get so caught up in our own rules, our doctrines, our ways of doing things, that we miss the point. We can become more concerned with being right than with being loving. We can perform our faith for others instead of living it authentically from the heart. The story of the Pharisees isn't just about a group of ancient religious leaders. It's a mirror. It forces us to ask ourselves, are we using our faith to build bridges or walls? Are we focused on the weightier matters of love, justice, and mercy? Is our religion a source of life and freedom for ourselves and others, or has it become a burdensome list of rules? By understanding who the Pharisees really were devout, passionate, knowledgeable, and deeply flawed people, just like we can read the Gospels with new eyes, we can better understand the world Jesus lived in, the controversies he faced, and the radical nature of his message of grace and love. And maybe, just maybe, we can avoid making the same mistakes ourselves. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive today. If you found this interesting, do you want to forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more content that goes beyond the surface of the Bible? See you next time.